The words escaped Linda Martinez's lips, with the exhausted honesty of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden alone for far too long. Steve Harvey stood motionless at his podium, staring at this 42-year-old woman, whose quiet dignity couldn't mask the weight of a responsibility that should have been shared by generations, not carried by one person barely out of her 20s herself. "I'm changing diapers at the age when I should be planning my retirement," Linda had said, her voice steady but carrying the bone-deep weariness of someone who hadn't had a full night's sleep in 3 years. "I'm raising 5 children who call me grandma, but need me to be their mama, because their real mama chose drugs over them." The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable pause between game show questions. It was the heavy, respectful quiet that settles when everyone in a room suddenly understands they're witnessing something that transcends entertainment, something that forces them to confront the hidden crisis that millions of grandparents face across America. Steve looked at Linda, sitting in the front row, surrounded by 5 children, ranging in age from 3 to 12, and saw something that broke every rule of game show hosting. This wasn't about Family Feud anymore. This was about a woman who had sacrificed her golden years to save her grandchildren from a system that often failed the most vulnerable. About love that looked like exhaustion and strength that looked like surrender. Let me take you back to how we arrived at this moment. How what started as a routine Family Feud taping became a masterclass in unexpected heroism, invisible sacrifice, and what it means to choose love, even when love costs everything. It was a warm September afternoon at the Steve Harvey Studios in Atlanta. The late summer energy filled the studio with the kind of optimism that made everything seem possible. But sitting in the front row was a family whose presence represented something much more complex than game show excitement. Linda Martinez, 42 years old, and looking simultaneously younger and older than her years, sat surrounded by her 5 grandchildren. 12-year-old Maria, 9-year-old Carlos, 7-year-old Sophia, 5-year-old Diego, and 3-year-old Isabella. At first glance, they looked like any large, loving family. But those who knew what to look for could see the signs of a household held together by one person's relentless determination. The way Linda's eyes constantly tracked all 5 children, the practiced efficiency with which she handed out snacks and settled minor disputes, the exhaustion that no amount of makeup could quite hide. Linda's journey to this moment had begun 3 years earlier, when her daughter Elena, struggling with opioid addiction, had been arrested for possession and lost custody of her 5 children. Rather than see them separated into different foster homes, Linda had made a decision that changed her life forever. She would raise them herself. The choice hadn't been made lightly. At 39, Linda had been looking forward to a different kind of life. Her own children were grown and independent. She was finally reaching a point where she could focus on her own dreams. Maybe travel, perhaps even think about retirement. Instead, she found herself starting over with 5 children who were traumatized, confused, and desperately in need of stability. The transition had been brutal. Linda worked as a nurse at a local hospital, but 5 children meant exponentially more expenses. Rent for a larger apartment, food, clothing, school supplies, medical bills. The costs were overwhelming on a single income. She'd taken on extra shifts whenever possible, sometimes working 60 hours a week, coming home to cook dinner, help with homework, read bedtime stories, and fall into bed exhausted, only to wake up a few hours later, when Isabella had nightmares, or Diego needed water. The physical exhaustion was manageable. Linda was strong, had always been a hard worker, but the emotional weight was staggering. These weren't just her grandchildren, they were children who asked when their mommy was coming home, who acted out their trauma in ways that tested every ounce of patience Linda possessed, who needed therapy and stability and a level of attention that one person couldn't possibly provide. The Family Feud opportunity had come through Maria's school, which had nominated families facing extraordinary circumstances for a special Community Heroes episode. Linda had initially declined, overwhelmed by the logistics of getting 5 children to Atlanta and taking time off work. She couldn't afford to lose. But the children had begged, and Linda, who had learned to find joy in small moments, had finally agreed. During the pre-show meet and greet, when Steve approached the Martinez family, he immediately noticed something special about their dynamic. While other families seemed excited about being on television, Linda was focused entirely on managing her children, making sure they were all accounted for, that they had water, that they understood how to behave in the studio. Mrs. Martinez, Steve had said, noting the respectful attention all 5 children gave to Linda. "You've got a beautiful family here. These your kids?" "My grandchildren," Linda had replied with the automatic response of someone who had explained the situation countless times. "I'm raising them." Steve had noticed something in Linda's tone, a weight behind those simple words. But the conversation had been brief, interrupted by production needs. The Martinez family had been selected to compete against the Rodriguez family from Florida, and from the moment the game started, it was clear that this was about more than typical Family Feud competition. Linda played with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every opportunity mattered, that this could potentially make a real difference in her family's life. The children, for their part, were amazingly well behaved. They cheered appropriately, sat still during filming, and showed the kind of maturity that children develop when they understand that their caregiver is doing her best under impossible circumstances. Steve was in his element, making jokes, working the crowd, creating those moments of connection that made Family Feud more than just a game show. But throughout the taping, he found himself repeatedly drawn to Linda, something about her quiet determination, and the way she managed 5 children with such practiced efficiency, drawing his admiration. The game progressed through 4 rounds, with the Martinez family performing exceptionally well. Linda's answers were thoughtful and strategic, and when she was uncertain, she deferred to the older children with a respect that spoke to the collaborative nature of their household. It was during the 5th round that everything changed. The survey question seemed routine enough. Name something that gets harder as you get older. Linda had just given a solid answer: staying up late. As the family celebrated the points earned in, Steve decided to engage more personally with the family. "That's a great answer, Linda," Steve said. "Speaking of things getting harder, as we get older, what's been the biggest change in your life recently?" The question was meant to be light, engaging, the kind of interaction that made Family Feud feel warm and personal. But when Linda looked up at Steve, her expression wasn't that of someone preparing to share a heartwarming story about family life. "Mr. Harvey," she said, her voice clear, but carrying a weight that made the studio begin to quiet. "May I be completely honest with you?" Steve nodded, sensing that whatever Linda wanted to share was important. 3 years ago, I thought my childrearing days were over," Linda said, her careful words making it clear she'd thought about this conversation many times. "My own kids were grown, and I was looking forward to a different kind of life. Then my daughter got addicted to drugs, lost custody of her 5 children, and I had to choose between letting them go into foster care or starting over as a mom at almost 4. The studio began to fall silent as people sensed that something significant was happening. Linda continued, her voice growing stronger, but also more vulnerable. "So now I'm changing diapers at the age when I should be planning my retirement. I'm helping with homework while other people my age are going out with friends. I'm reading bedtime stories when I should be reading books for pleasure. And don't get me wrong, I love these children more than life itself. But some days I feel like I'm drowning, like I'm failing them because I don't have the energy I had 20 years ago." Steve felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that this conversation had moved far beyond entertainment into territory that demanded his full attention and respect. "Linda," Steve said, his voice gentler now, "tell me about what a typical day looks like for you." Linda looked at her 5 grandchildren, then back at Steve. "I wake up at 5 a.m. to get ready for work. I work a 12-hour shift at the hospital. I come home and cook dinner, help with homework, give baths, read stories, and get everyone to bed. Then I do laundry, prep for the next day, and maybe get 4 hours of sleep before starting over." She paused, her controlled facade beginning to crack slightly. "Weekends are for grocery shopping, cleaning, taking kids to appointments, and trying to catch up on everything I couldn't do during the week. I haven't had a day off in 3 years. I haven't been to a movie or out to dinner or done anything just for me since this all started." The audience was completely silent now, drawn into Linda's story, not by entertainment value, but by the raw honesty of someone sharing truths that millions of grandparents live with but rarely speak aloud. And the hardest part, Linda continued, tears beginning to form in her eyes, is that these beautiful children ask me when their mommy is coming home, and I don't know what to tell them. I don't know if Elena will ever get clean. I don't know if she'll ever be able to be their mother again, so I'm trying to be everything to them. Grandmother, mother, father, teacher, nurse, friend. And some days, I feel like I'm not enough. Steve Harvey, who had made America laugh for decades, who had built a career on connection and joy, found himself facing something that broke every rule of game show hosting. This wasn't about Family Feud anymore. This was about a woman who had given up her dreams to save 5 children's futures, who was carrying a burden that society often ignored. Steve set down his cards and walked directly toward Linda, abandoning the game entirely. When he reached the family, he knelt down so he could address not just Linda, but all 5 children. Linda, Steve said, first, I want you to know that what you just shared takes incredible courage. But I also want you to know something else. You're not drowning. You're swimming upstream, and that's completely different. He looked at Maria, Carlos, Sofia, Diego, and Isabella, 5 children, who were watching this exchange with the intensity of kids who understood that something important was happening. Kids, Steve said, addressing them directly. Do you know how lucky you are? You have a grandmother who loves you so much that she gave up her own dreams to make sure you could have yours. That's not just love. That's heroism. Steve stood up and addressed Linda again. You said you feel like you're not enough, but let me tell you what I see. I see 5 children who are clean, well-behaved, clearly loved, and thriving despite incredible trauma. I see a woman who has worked miracles with limited resources. I see someone who chose love over convenience, sacrifice over comfort. He turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying an authority that transcended entertainment. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, Linda Martinez just shared something with us that represents one of the most under-recognized crises in America. There are millions of grandparents raising their grandchildren because their own children can't or won't. These are people who thought their childbearing days were over, who are starting over with limited resources and aging bodies, who are heroes that society barely acknowledges. Steve turned back to Linda, his expression showing the profound respect he felt for her situation. Linda, you keep saying you're just doing what you have to do, but let me tell you something. Nobody has to sacrifice their retirement to raise someone else's children. You chose to do that because you understood that love sometimes looks like giving up everything you wanted for yourself to give someone else what they need. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. This has my phone number on it, he said, handing it to Linda. And I want you to call me this week, because no hero should have to fight alone. But Steve wasn't finished. He addressed the cameras directly. I want everyone watching this to understand something, he said. Grandparents raising grandchildren aren't just babysitting. They're saving lives, preserving families, and often sacrificing their own futures to make sure children have a chance at theirs. Linda Martinez and families like hers need our support, our recognition, and our commitment to ensuring that love doesn't have to choose between financial security and family preservation. The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. The standing ovation wasn't the typical game show applause. It was recognition of sacrifice, acknowledgement of heroism, and commitment to support. Linda, overwhelmed by the acceptance and understanding she had never dared to hope for, broke down completely. Maria immediately moved to hug her grandmother, and the other 4 children quickly joined, creating a circle of love that proved that families aren't defined by biology, but by choice, commitment, and daily acts of devotion. The episode that aired 6 weeks later became one of the most watched and most discussed in Family Feud history, not because of the game, but because viewers witnessed something powerful: a grandmother's courage in sharing her truth, and a community's response in offering support rather than judgment. But the real story happened after the cameras stopped rolling. True to his word, Steve connected Linda with resources she didn't even know existed. Through his foundation, Linda was enrolled in a support program for grandparents raising grandchildren, connecting her with others facing similar challenges, and providing access to financial assistance, legal help, and counseling services. Steve's foundation also established a childcare assistance program, allowing Linda to reduce her work hours slightly while maintaining her income. This gave her the precious gift of time, time to attend school events, time to help with homework without rushing, time to occasionally do something just for herself. Most importantly, Steve arranged for Elena to receive treatment at one of the best addiction recovery facilities in the country. Recovery wasn't guaranteed, but for the first time in 3 years, there was hope that the children might someday have their mother back. Linda also began speaking at support groups and community events about her experience, always emphasizing that grandparents raising grandchildren aren't victims. They're heroes who chose love over convenience. Her message resonated with thousands of families facing similar challenges. 6 months after that Family Feud taping, Linda Martinez was still tired, still stretched thin, still facing challenges that most people couldn't imagine. But she was no longer facing them alone. She had a support network, financial assistance, and most importantly, the recognition that what she was doing mattered. The 5 children continued to thrive under Linda's care. Maria became an honor student who tutored younger children. Carlos joined the soccer team and found an outlet for his energy. Sophia discovered a love of reading that helped her process her emotions. Diego started kindergarten with confidence and social skills. Isabella, the youngest, began calling Linda Mama occasionally, and Linda learned that love doesn't require perfect titles, it just requires showing up every day. Steve established the Linda Martinez Grandparent Heroes Foundation, providing financial assistance, legal support, and respite care for grandparents raising their grandchildren. The foundation has helped thousands of families, always emphasizing that these caregivers aren't just filling in, they're stepping up in ways that deserve society's full support. 2 years after that episode aired, Elena completed her rehabilitation program and began supervised visits with her children. Recovery is a process, not an event, but for the first time in years, there was hope for family reunification. Whether that happens or not, Linda knows she gave her grandchildren the stability they needed during their most vulnerable years. Steve Harvey learned something that day that changed how he approaches every show, every interaction with families, every moment he spends in the public eye. He learned that heroism doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it looks like a 42-year-old woman changing diapers when she should be planning vacations, choosing exhaustion over abandonment, picking love over convenience. Linda's story became more than just a television moment. It became a catalyst for conversations about the grandparent custody crisis, about supporting kinship caregivers, and about recognizing that some of our greatest heroes are hiding in plain sight, raising children they never planned to raise, because love demanded they step up. Because sometimes a grandmother's honest confession about unexpected motherhood can teach an entire studio about the meaning of sacrifice. Sometimes a game show can become a platform for recognizing unsung heroes. And sometimes the most powerful television happens when someone decides that celebrating everyday heroism matters more than any script, any ratings consideration, any show business protocol. Linda's truth, that she's changing diapers when she should be planning retirement, became a rallying cry for supporting kinship caregivers, and a reminder that families are built not just by birth, but by choice, commitment, and the daily decision to put children's needs above personal comfort. Today, when Linda Martinez looks at her 5 grandchildren, she doesn't see the retirement she gave up. She sees 5 futures she helped secure, 5 lives she helped save, 5 reasons why love sometimes asks us to start over when we thought we were finished. And that may be the most beautiful kind of heroism of all.